Hello, welcome to Standlee Premium Western Forage Hay University. Today's topic is Forage 101. We will discuss the following topics. First, the importance of forage, Western forages, Forage 101, the nutrient content of forage, different physical forms of forage, mechanical processing of forage, and then we'll end this discussion with some interactive questions. Forage is the most important dietary component. Forage and pasture are those two sources of fibrous material that horses require in their digestive system. In the previous training session, Equine 101, we discussed the horse's digestive system and how anatomically horses must have fiber in their diet for that digestive system to function properly. So forage and pasture are critical for horses. Unfortunately, pasture is seasonable. We can have drought, which will not have enough moisture to allow grass to grow, and we can also have availability, which is influenced by weather conditions such as snow or winter, which will not allow pasture to grow. So with pasture often seasonable and limited, forage is absolutely critical. Standlee Premium Western Forage grows and sells forage products, and these products are premium Western forages. Now we have established that forage is the primary component of the diet, or should be the most important ingredient in the diet. Unfortunately, many of our horse clients will think that grain or supplements are the most important components of the diet, and this is simply not true. If we go back to the Equine 101 and we look at the large area of the digestive system that's dedicated to the digestion of forage, we can clearly see that forage is the primary ingredient in the diet, and it's not grain or supplements that are as important as forage. So the Standlee Premium Western Forages do not compete with grain. They're a different category. They're a required nutrient or a required component of the diet for horses. Grain and supplement products actually need good quality and quantity of forage to work. In other words, horses need good quality forage to make their supplements and grains work better. So simplified, horses actually need Standlee Premium Western Forage. Not all horses need a grain or a supplement, but they do need Premium Western Forage from Standlee. Now we will turn our attention to Western forages and how these forages are often different than a lot of the local forages that we see in other parts of the United States and other parts of the world. Western forages are known to be of top quality. In fact, we typically spend a lot of these forages are exported to foreign countries at very high prices because of the high quality, and they're also been used for the last 4 Olympic Games, meaning that the forages from the Western United States were selected above all others as providing the best quality, most nutrient-dense source for these Olympic-style horses. So how do we judge the value, or how do we determine the value of Western forage? One of the first things that people will evaluate is the visual quality. They will look at the color of hay. Hay is intended to be green, and the more green color in hay indicates a higher vitamin content. So many of our local hays that become yellow or brownish in color have actually lost vitamin content compared to our premium Western forages. With alfalfa, we often look to the leaf to stem ratio. On a stem of alfalfa, how many leaves are present? The more leaves that are present, the higher the nutrient content. Again, with western forages where we can put them up in good climatic conditions, we do not get leaf loss or loss of leaf from the stem, and we have a highly nutritious product. With grass hays, we look at the seed head and the length of the seed head. The longer a seed head is, the more mature a plant is, and the lower the quality. With premium Standlee western forages, we cut these with shorter seed heads to ensure we have the highest quality product available. We also look visually at stem thickness. If you take a sample of hay and hold it in your hand and then break it, if you can hear visual stems cracking, it's a very coarse hay. It's not very nutrient dense. In other words, it's put a lot of its nutrients into fiber components and not into nutrition such as protein, energy, or vitamins and minerals. We certainly at Standlee Premium Western Forage want to make sure that there's no dust or mold associated with our hay. Horses are very sensitive to both dust and mold, and forage put up in the western United States, because again of our great climatic conditions, we don't have to worry about hay getting rained on or not curing properly, so we have very little problem with dust or mold. And finally, hay can have foreign material. Foreign material can be described as anything that can't outrun the baler. So foreign material could be things like small animals, rodents. It could be also paper and plastic and cans and wire. These things certainly aren't recommended for horses to eat, and these are not found in Standlee Premium Western Forage. A more precise method to determine the quality of western forages is to determine the nutrient content with laboratory analysis. This is where the hay is actually sent to a laboratory, and through analysis they determine the chemical quality. We have in western forages lots of protein and lots of energy, but because our soils, like soils in other parts of the country, we often find that hay can be deficient in copper, zinc, and selenium. These are important trace elements for horses. Now, with some forages, even forages grown in the western United States, we find that these forages can be deficient in calcium and phosphorus. This is not the case in premium western forages, because these are routinely added back to the soils to ensure our plant is very highly nutritious. Now, the difference in chemical qualities of hay is determined a lot by fertilization. You need to replace the nutrients that hay is taking from the soil, put those back in the soil through fertilization. At Standlee Premium Western Forage, we follow very closely the nutrient content of our fields so that we can produce the highest nutritive quality hay for horses. Now we will discuss some of the basics about forage in what I call the Forage 101 section of this topic. The first question often asked in Forage 101 is what type of forage is actually best to feed a horse? Do you feed an alfalfa hay? Do you feed a grass hay? Which cutting of grass hay or which cutting of alfalfa is best for horses? And we will discuss all of that. But suffice it to say, many different types of forages are available, and horses can consume all of the different types of forages without problem. Forage is a source of all 5 essential nutrients that are required by horses. Forage has some water associated with it, usually about 10% moisture. Forage also contains protein. It contains energy or calories. Forage contains vitamins as well as minerals. The content of these nutrients, the content of water, protein, energy, vitamins, and minerals, cannot be determined visually. In other words, you can't simply look at a forage and say it is high in protein or it is high in mineral content. You actually have to send the forage to the lab to actually determine the actual nutritive quality of forages. With that said, let's now talk about some of the nutrient content of forage and some general trends we see in nutrient content of the different forage varieties. One of the primary determinants of nutrient content of forage is what type of forage it is. Is it an alfalfa forage? Is it a grass forage like timothy or orchard grass? That will determine partially the nutrient profile of the finished feed or the finished forage. The other thing, or other things that determine nutrient content of forage, are the growing conditions that that plant has. The soil fertility. Are those plants able to grow in soils that are high in nutrients so that these plants can take these nutrients from the soil and incorporate them into the forage? Other growing condition variables are water. Is the forage getting adequate water content? Is it stressed by drought, or does it have adequate water so that it can grow naturally? Then finally, the drying conditions. Forage that is cut and lays in a field and then gets damaged by rain loses some of its nutrient concentration. So climates which are very dry and can allow forage to dry very quickly without rain damage actually increase the nutrient profile of the finished forage. The cutting is often thought to influence the nutrient content of hay or forage, but actually it's not the cutting that is important, it's actually the stage of maturity at the time the plant was harvested. And when plants go from the size of your lawn to the size of a pasture to the size of hay, ultimately to the size of trees, the taller the plant becomes, the less digestible that plant becomes. It gets more of its material as non-digestible fiber, lignified fiber to help the plant stand up, and it becomes less digestible to the animal. So remember, the taller that hay becomes, the less digestible. And it's not the cutting that determines that, it's the size of the plant at the time that it's actually cut. Now let's look at some of the nutrient content that we consider standard for some of the different types of Standlee Premium Western forage. Let's first begin with alfalfa forage. Typically, alfalfa forage is high in protein. Typically, it's greater than 14% protein. It's also high in energy or calories, meaning that a horse doesn't have to eat much alfalfa to be able to get enough calories to maintain their body weight. Alfalfa is typically high in calcium, it is moderate in phosphorus content, and moderate in fiber content. Now, interestingly, alfalfa hay is low in sugar content, so the amount of starch, water-soluble carbohydrate, and ethanol-soluble carbohydrate, the amount of sugar in that hay is very low. And then finally, alfalfa has a high relative feed value, meaning there's a lot of nutrients available in alfalfa, and these nutrients are very available or very digestible for horses. The take-home message for alfalfa, higher in protein, higher in calories, also very low in sugar content. When we start talking about nutrient content of grass hay, one of the first varieties of grass hay that we'll often consider is timothy grass forage. And timothy grass, compared to alfalfa, is moderate in protein, with a protein content around 10 to 12%. It's also moderate in energy compared to alfalfa, meaning timothy has fewer calories per pound than an equal weight of alfalfa. Timothy is generally lower in calcium and lower in phosphorus compared to alfalfa, but the ratio of those two nutrients is very favorable. Timothy is higher in fiber compared to an alfalfa forage. Interestingly enough, our grass hays, timothy included, are very high in carbohydrate content. They're high in water-soluble carbohydrate and high in ethanol-soluble carbohydrate. So the sugars in grass hay compared to alfalfa hay are higher. Now, the total amount of nutrients that a horse can get, the relative feed value of a timothy grass, is less than they could get from an alfalfa, but is still a high quality forage and still at a moderate relative feed value. Another popular grass that is often fed to horses is orchard grass forage. Typically, orchard grass forage, like timothy, is moderate in protein and moderate in energy or calorie content, again compared to our alfalfa forages. Like timothy, orchard grass is also low in calcium and phosphorus, but the ratio is very good. Orchard grass is high in fiber, not as high typically as timothy hay is in fiber, but is still certainly higher in fiber content than your average alfalfa hay. Finally, like the timothy, orchard grass is also high in its sugar content, or can be high in its sugar content. So it has a high water-soluble carbohydrate as well as a high ethanol-soluble carbohydrate. Compared to alfalfa, orchard grass forage has a moderate relative feed value, meaning you can't get quite as many calories or quite as much nutrition out of an orchard grass compared to the average alfalfa grass. Orchard grass is typically considered to be a higher nutritive value compared to most timothy forages. So orchard grass is a very good selection for most horses. If we were going to rank different Standlee Premium Western forages and rank them, for example, from protein from the highest to the lowest, that ranking would be as follows. Our highest protein hays would be our alfalfa hay, followed by our mixed hay. Our alfalfa timothy, our alfalfa oat would be moderate in protein content. The lower protein choices would be the orchard grass and the timothy. Again, this is a ranking of protein content from the highest, alfalfa, to the lowest, which is timothy. If we were going to rank the Standlee Premium Western forages according to energy or calorie content, again from the highest to the lowest, alfalfa contains the highest number of calories per pound compared to any other variety of Standlee Premium Western forage. Again, the lower content would be with our mixed hays, our alfalfa timothy, our alfalfa oat, and then finally the lower calorie hays would be the orchard grass and the timothy. So alfalfa will always contain more calories per pound compared to a timothy grass or an orchard grass hay. Now, if we looked at the sugar content of hay, again ranking these Standlee Premium Western forage sugar from the highest to the lowest, we find that our orchard grass hay likely has the highest sugar content, and that's followed by timothy, and then the lowest sugar content is actually found in our alfalfa or our alfalfa mixed forages. Now, sugar can be an important component of a diet for horses that have different sugar sensitivities, such as laminitis, insulin resistance, or some of the Cushing's type disease. So knowing the sugar content of forages, of Standlee Premium Western forages, remember that our alfalfa or our mixed forages are always going to be lower in sugar content compared to our grass forages. In the first training session, our Equine 101, we actually discussed the nutrient system or the digestive system of a horse. And we found that because of the anatomy and style of the digestive system, that forage is the most important component of the diet. In addition, in that lecture, we found that forage was a source of all of the essential nutrients for horses. Forage contains water, protein, energy or calories, minerals, and vitamins. So why do we need to feed horses grain or supplements? The only reason to feed a horse any type of grain or supplement is simply because the forage does not provide enough nutrients. For example, a broodmare that is pregnant, she's actively growing a fetus inside her, she may not be able to get enough minerals from eating a forage-only diet. We can supplement that mare with additional minerals through a grain concentrate or a supplement. With regard to performance horses, a performance horse may not be able to get enough calories from eating hay alone. In other words, a horse may fill up on fiber, not have that fiber efficiently digested or fermented by bacteria, and not be able to generate enough calories for it to sustain as difficult an exercise as many of these performance horses undergo. So these horses would need additional calories from a grain concentrate or a supplement, and they may also need additional minerals to help repair the skeletal tissue. Finally, with growing horses, if those growing horses are fed a low protein forage, they may not be able to get enough quality protein from that forage alone. Therefore, we'd want to feed a grain concentrate or a supplement with additional protein and minerals to help those young horses achieve a sound skeletal growth. Now let's progress into talking about the different physical forms of the forages available from Standlee Premium Western Forage. Many of you are familiar with the different physical forms of forage that are available from Standlee Premium Western Forage. And the physical forms are the conventional baled forage. Many of us have fed conventional baled forage, whether it's a 2-string forage, a 3-string forage, as the normal small bales we often think about for feeding horses. At Standlee Premium Western Forage, we have conventional baled forage in the 3-string bale. We also have bales of forage, long stem forage, in what we call a compressed bale, where that bale starts out as a large bale, it's cut and pressed into a smaller bale so that they can be of uniform weight and size, making it very convenient to feed to horses. We can also take forage, long stem hay, harvested from the field. We can take that hay, we can grind it, and we can actually form it into large cubes. This is another physical form of hay. We can take that same hay, grind it, force it through a smaller die, making a pellet. Again, the difference between a forage cube and a forage pellet is the size of die that we push that ground forage through. And then finally, we can take that long stem forage or that baled forage and we can chop it. We can cut it into smaller pieces. That's often found in chopped forage products. The next thing that we need to address is what is the nutrition difference between these different physical forms. The primary nutrition difference that we see with forages are in the chopped forage products. These chopped forage products have a higher calorie content. Now, the higher calorie content is not due to the forage because of additives, but is actually due to the things that we put on the forage to make sure the forage does not become dusty when we chop it into smaller pieces. So the increased calorie content of forage is actually found with molasses and corn oil that are often, canola oil, that are often added to the chopped forage products. These two ingredients, molasses and canola oil, add additional calories to the forage. Again, the chopping of the forage does not add calories. It's simply the additives that we do to reduce any potential dustiness, primarily canola oil, that increases the calorie content of the finished product. Now we will spend some more time talking about the specific mechanical processing that forages undergo at Standlee Premium Western Forage to form our different forage products. The first mechanical processing that we do at Standlee Premium Western Forage is we often take baled forage to compressed forage. And what this requires is the squeezing of our conventional bales and then the cutting of those into smaller bales. So converting baled forage to compressed forage simply takes the conventional bales, requires us to squeeze and cut those bales, reband them, and put them into uniform, smaller compressed hay. Now the conversion of baled forage to cube, what we do in that process is we take the hay, we remove the strings, and we put the baled forage into a grinding machine. We reduce the particle size or cut the particle size down or grind the product. Then we add heat and steam and pressure, natural clay binder, and we force that through a die, making a large cube. With baled forage to pellets, we do the same thing, except we grind that hay to a finer degree. We also add heat and steam, pressure, and then we put that through a pellet die or a smaller die so that we can take that baled forage and actually make it into a smaller pellet. With respect to baled forage to chop, again, this is taking our baled forage, it's giving it coarse grinding, then we add an additive to it, depending on the product, whether it's molasses or whether it's a canola oil, to decrease the dustiness of that product. And those are some of the mechanical processes that occur at Standlee Premium Western Forage. Now, it is often thought that mechanical processing of hay, in other words, compressing hay, grinding hay, pelleting hay, cubing hay, or even chopping hay, does something to the digestibility of the hay. And it does not. So all of our mechanical processing does not change the digestibility of the forage. So a good quality second cut alfalfa, okay, has the identical digestion, whether it's as a compressed bale, a conventional bale, whether it's a pelleted forage, a cube forage, or even a chop forage, the exact same digestibility. And the reason for that is because these forages are digested in the large intestine or the hindgut of the horse. In other words, those forages have been chewed by the horse, masticated or chewed by the horse, and then they're reduced to a particle size that the horse can then digest. So our processing, our grinding, pelleting, and cubing do not change something that a horse couldn't do by himself. Another thing that's very important is how digestible is forage. And the very best forage, the very best Standlee Premium Western Forage is only about 50% digestible by horses. This is because the bacteria in the hindgut or the large intestine of the horse are not 100% efficient in digesting that. Now, the digestibility of local hay, some of our local hays, is far lower than 50%, and some horse owners are thoroughly convinced that they pick up more manure than they actually end up feeding by weight in hay. Now, we know that's not true, but our Standlee Premium Western Forages will be certainly more digestible than our local hays, but even the best Standlee Premium Western Forage, they're only about 50% digestible. So, if processing does not change the digestibility of our forage, why would we go ahead and process forage? Well, the number one reason is convenience. By taking our large square bales and putting them into compressed bales or pellets or cubes or even chopped, they're easier to feed. They're also easier to haul. In other words, you can put a bag of pellets or a bag of cubes or even a wrapped compressed bale in the back of your car and not get hay all over or waste a significant amount of product. Another reason to process forage is it makes a very consistent product. In other words, you mix the leaves with the stems in the grinding process, a very uniform process, and the horses will eat it very uniformly and not have any problem with its consistency. Also, by feeding a process forage, there's an endless supply. Standlee Premium Western Forage is able to grow our own forage so that we'll always have enough pellets, enough cubes, enough chop or compressed bales to satisfy your needs. It's consistent, it's convenient, so it will always be available for you. With process forages, they take less storage space. In other words, storing forage as pellets or cubes or even our compressed bales requires less space in your barn, and therefore we can store that more efficiently. Now, when we feed these forages, the process forages typically have less waste. A horse doesn't throw hay out of his tub when he's fed a pellet or a cube. He simply consumes those products. If a pellet or a cube is dropped on the ground, the horse can actually recover this, can pick it back up, rather than with conventional hay, long hay from two-string bales, where they'll often try to waste that. The other thing that our processing does, we inspect all our hay before it is actually processed, and the processing methods that we use actually certify our hay is certified noxious weed-free. We do this with a number of the Standlee Premium Western Forage products, and you can look at that on the labeling to make sure you're not replanting weeds into your pasture or taking weeds into the forest where they're not allowed. Now, I've written a series of interactive questions that I think you should be able to answer based on the knowledge that we have learned in this particular presentation. So now we'll go ahead and move to those questions, and hopefully you'll be able to answer them correctly. The first question, this is a true or false question. Forage is the most important part of the horse's diet. True or false? We know that this is true based on the information we learned in this presentation, as well as the information in the first presentation, the Equine 101. We know that forage is the most important component of the diet because that's anatomically the way the horse's digestive system is designed to function. The next question, true or false? Nutrient content of hay can be determined visually. This is false. We know to actually determine the nutrient content of hay, it needs to be sent to a laboratory for chemical analysis. There are many things that we can tell visually about hay, including the quality. Does it have dust or mold? Does it have foreign material? Is it bright green? Does it have leaves? Those sorts of things, but we actually can't determine the nutrient content without sending it to a laboratory for analysis. The third question, alfalfa is high in sugar. True or false? This is false. Alfalfa is the lowest sugar content of any of the Standlee Premium Western forages. Alfalfa does not store carbohydrate in the sugar form. The fourth question, Timothy has the highest protein content compared to other forages. True or false? That is false. Timothy is certainly lower in protein than alfalfa, certainly lower in protein compared to our alfalfa mixed forages, and then also routinely lower in protein compared to even orchard grass. So alfalfa is the highest, and Timothy is often the lowest crude protein content. And number 5, forage cubes or pellets are more digestible than hay. The answer to that question is false. Remember that processing, cubing or pelleting, does not increase the digestibility of the hay. It does not change. So a good quality hay or good quality forage in a compressed bale, a pellet, or a cube is actually the exact same digestibility. Processing does not influence that. So hopefully this answered some of the questions that you may have had on forage in our Forage 101 at Standlee Premium Western Forage, Forage University. But to contact us, please email us at customerservice@standleeforage.com or phone 800-398-0819 with any of your questions. Again, we appreciate you taking the time to learn about Standlee Premium Western Forage.